Hey everyone, just before we get to this episode, do you want to start, grow, or monetize your podcast but feel stuck or overwhelmed? Join the Podcast Lab, a monthly membership with live training, templates, support, and a community to help you launch and grow with confidence. Get clarity, stay consistent, and finally build the podcast you've been dreaming of. Join the Podcast Lab today and take your next bold step. The link is in the description to join. Now, let's get into this episode. Has anyone ever come to you and say, hey, I want to be on your podcast, and you had to, you looked them up, you did your research and said, sorry, I don't want to have you on my podcast? Have you ever had to do that before?
Yes, and it is kind of awkward. As you go on, it gets easier because you start listening to understand rather than just listening to respond.
What advice do you have for a podcaster out there who is trying their hardest to connect with their audience, to get more downloads, to get more listens on their podcast? What advice do you have for that person?
You have to have a place for the audience to come and learn from you other than just the episodes.
What are some of the intangible things that podcasters can do to become better?
I love that question.
Hey everyone, today on the podcast, we're sitting down with an audio expert who is helping entrepreneurs sound their best and grow their brand one episode at a time. I'm joined by Hayleigh Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production. In this conversation, we talked about what makes a podcast stand out and some really good strategies that can transform your podcast. So whether you're just getting started or looking to level up your show, this episode is packed with tips to help you sound professional and podcast with purpose. But before we jump into this episode, I want to give a huge shout out to my friend Jay Hall. He is the host of the Okie Bookcast, which is a podcast that connects curious readers like you to your next great read by featuring Oklahoma voices and stories. And I want to encourage you to go and listen to his podcast. But now get ready to take some notes from this episode that I had with Hayleigh. It was really good. So let's get into it right now. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of I Made a Podcast. Today, I'm here with Hayleigh Hayhurst. Hayleigh, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. How are you doing?
I am doing so amazing. I'm so glad that we're here talking today. I've been following you for a while on Instagram, and I'm loving some of the content that you're putting out. And you're a podcaster, you're a producer as well, you're a coach. But rather than me introduce you to everybody, why don't you introduce yourself? Because I think I'm going to get it wrong if I start to list off the things that you've done so far. But maybe you can introduce yourself to everyone so that everyone knows who Hayleigh is.
Yeah, definitely. So as mentioned, my name is Hayleigh Hayhurst. My business is Espresso Podcast Production. I work with businesses and brands to support them in creating podcasts that will reach the right audience, get them clients, really grow their brand visibility. I've been doing this for the past 5 years. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, originally from Las Vegas. And I started my business when I moved up here. So it's been fun. It's been really fun. I work with a lot of cool clients across the board, everything from business to mindset to I even have clients in the bridal space and just all across the board, just different entrepreneurs and different niches. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I do.
Wonderful. Okay. Now you have two podcasts. One is called From Employee to Boss, and then the other one's called Espresso Podcast Cafe. Just before we get into the nitty gritty of our conversations, can you just maybe let us know why you decided to get into podcasting and how did this whole thing start for you?
Yeah, it's actually a long story. I'll try to make it short for the sake of the podcast. But I went to school in Las Vegas. I went to UNLV and I was studying journalism. A friend and we decided to start a podcast since we had access to podcasting studios at the time. And we were like, well, why not just do this? Like, we got to catch up with each other in the process and focus on our journalism degree. So we started that show. Fast forward, I never thought that podcasting would take me anywhere. But when I moved up to Seattle, a connection I had from Vegas messaged me and was like, hey, I know that you used to have a podcast. I have one. My business is really growing right now and I don't have time to manage it. Can I pay you? And this was during the pandemic. I was laid off, so I was unemployed. And I was like, you'll pay me? Great. Thank you. And so I started running her show for her and was really loving it. I didn't know that podcast production was a career I could go down. like I said, I just started this random podcast with a friend. She still does it today and is like killing it in the game. But it just, one thing led to another. From this one client, I got another and built my business on referrals. Then I started thinking of my business as a business and realized in that process, I needed to meet people because I had gone from graduating college to thinking I was going to go into corporate to becoming an entrepreneur. So what I did was start Employee to Boss. I thought that if I started that podcast, I would, meet more entrepreneurs, be able to interview people. People love giving their time away, especially if they get something from it. So getting people on a podcast was so easy for me. I just would go in Facebook groups or Instagram and, invite them onto the show, interview them about their journey from Employee to Boss. So Employee to Boss for me was a networking podcast through and through. Like that is the number one reason I did it. And I still do it to this day, nearly 3 years later, I believe, maybe a little bit longer. But that podcast I do 2 times a week or 2 times a month. And then I started Podcast Cafe in November of 2024 because I wanted to shift my focus to talking with more podcasters. I had built a very robust network here in Seattle and online. I had tons of connections, and I realized I wanted to get more insights from podcasters for podcasters and be more in the coaching space of podcasting. So that's when I started Podcast Cafe, and it's been a lot of fun. I do 2 episodes a week on there. So I do a solo episode coaching on a certain topic, and then I have a guest speaking about their podcast and their podcast journey.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so this is great. As we mentioned before, there's a lot of things that we do that are very similar. One of the things that we both do is interview other podcasters or other guests, period, right? How do you prepare for your interviews? What kind of things do you do beforehand, whether it be, researching a client or even anything that you may listen to before, or anything that you do that helps you to ensure that the episode or the conversation that you're going to have with someone is going to be a good conversation? What do you do?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this yesterday. So that's so funny that you ask, because my process has definitely changed throughout my, 7+ years of podcasting. When I first started, I was so nervous to do interviews. I would do so much research. I would write out like a bunch of questions, and it was very much almost like an interview in like the typical sense of question, answer. As I got more comfortable behind the mic, and I mentioned I had that podcast before with a friend. It was just me and her co-hosting. So we had like our structure. But when I started Employee to Boss, that was the first time I was ever doing interviews. So as I got more comfortable with the interviewing process, I'm pretty social. So I think, talk to a wall, honestly. Like I have no problem chatting with anyone. And so now my process more looks like I have a form that they fill out. I ask them for their bio. I ask them what they want to talk about, because I think that's so important to ask your guests of like, what are your expertise? Because that's what they're going to be the most personable about. And so, yeah, so I just ask them about that. And then really I just see where the conversation goes. But I wouldn't recommend that for first-time podcast interviews. I definitely would recommend the more like rigorous research process. But now that I've done this for so long, it's easier to just go in and see where the conversation goes.
So for new podcasters out there, they should have some sort of formal process when they're going to prepare for their interviews, some sort of research that they do beforehand. And as they get more comfortable in it, then, the types of questions or the things that they would ask to make sure that the conversation stays engaging, it kind of comes natural, basically. Yeah. That's basically what you're saying, right?
Exactly. And I think as you go on, it gets easier because you start listening to understand rather than just listening to respond. Absolutely. And I see this in so many podcasts of, like I mentioned, I would ask a question, they would answer. I'd ask another question. There was no conversation. That's because I was listening just to respond. But when I started listening to understand, which is what I think all podcasters should strive for, that's when the podcast interviews actually got more interesting and it sounded more like a conversation.
Right. Yeah. Now, have you ever had to say like no to some, like you talked about your network, right? You talked about how much your network. Has anyone ever come to you and say, hey, I want to be on your podcast, and you had to, you looked them up, you did your research and said, sorry, I don't want to have you on my podcast? Have you ever had to do that before?
Yes, and it is kind of awkward. I tend to stay away from like some certain topics, a lot around like politics and, especially now in America.
For sure.
I need to protect my peace over here. And so for employee to boss, I interview entrepreneurs. So as long as they're an entrepreneur, I'm pretty open to interviewing them. I guess it does, like, there's some core beliefs that I have that like maybe I'll stray away from, but there's been no times where I was like, oh my God, like, no. Or if I say no, they don't come back and argue. I think there's so many podcasts that if they're not right for mine, they'll just go find another.
Yeah. It's always hard to say no. Like for me, like I love to like serve people and help people. But like someone asked me the other day, hey, Chris, I want to be on your podcast. I could do this and I could do that. And I want to talk about this. And I was just like, I wanted to just tell them no, like point blank, but I had to, I took a little bit more strategic approach. I said, okay, can you write and email me and let me know something that you are passionate or that you want to talk about? And then we could talk about it and see if there's anything there. Because I feel like if I'm going to have anyone on my podcast, I want to make sure it's something of value that can be, beneficial for the listeners. So if you just want to talk about, I don't know, wallpaper, sorry, it's the wrong podcast over here.
Exactly. No, and I'm sure it's the same with you. Like I get pitches all the time, like at least 2 a day in my email inbox. And some of them stand out, some of them don't. A lot, as you probably know, are AI. And so it's like this message is going to 100 different podcasters with one click. So I think those I just ignore, honestly.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like me saying no, but it's just me being like, put some effort into this.
Exactly. Yeah. And especially with AI, it's just like they probably just, scrape a whole bunch of email addresses off the internet and just don't even know who it's being sent out to. Yeah. Now, this is like that comment about AI and connecting with people actually leads me to my next question that I was going to ask you. Now, I know we're both podcasters and we've been in this for a while. I want to ask you, and this is something that I think will help anyone out there listening, but in your experience, both as a podcaster and as a coach, someone who helps other podcasters, what are the best ways to connect with the audience? So for those podcasters out there listening, they may be trying with Reels, they might be trying with Facebook groups and doing this and doing that and everything down the line. But in your experience, what advice do you have for a podcaster out there who is trying their hardest to connect with their audience, to get more downloads, to get more listens on their podcast? What advice do you have for that person?
Yeah, and I think that's a really frustrating place to be in sometimes, where podcast analytics aren't great. So you're like, who is listening, right? Yeah. Like who is listening? And if you go and look at different websites like Apple Podcast Connect, Spotify for Creators, the numbers aren't the same. So you're like, what is true here? But I think the most important thing with any podcast in any industry is building community around it. So having a community first mindset of knowing your niche, knowing what topic you're going to talk about, and creating specific content that the audience will be interested in at that time. So for a while, you might not hear from anyone. But if you are creating the right content, they'll be listening and they'll reach out when they have that time. So I like to think of podcasting, if you're doing all year round, as a calendar, right? And so if you think of like in the winter time, it's cold out, right? If you have like a lifestyle podcast, you might want to talk more about like, let's just say you have a dating podcast, like dating relationships. Okay, in the winter, you're probably going to be thinking about like cuffing season and all of these different like relationship type things. And then in the summer, it might be about getting outside and dating. So if you are creating the content for the audience at the time that they are in with, what's going on in the real world, they're going to be able to connect with you easier. So I think that's number one, just creating the content that relates to them at that time. Another example is I work with a lot of business coaches. In the winter, people are probably going home for the holidays. They're not going to want to go into a big push in their business. So if you're talking about launches and, hustle in November and December, you're not going to be received very well. If you're talking about that in the summer, spring, it'll come across better. So I think number one, that's it. And then, as you mentioned, like Reels and Instagram, we can't really put out a podcast without having some sort of social media element to it.
Yeah.
Or at least like a newsletter, right? You have to have a place for the audience to come and learn from you other than just the episodes. And that doesn't mean you can't use the podcast as the backbone of your business, right? The podcast can be what you use to create reels, which I know you do, Chris. You use the podcast clips to post on social media. You can then post a blog post and a newsletter and post, quote cards and all of these things. It can really be the backbone of your business, but you do have to have some element to actually promote the podcast.
Mm-hmm. So what do you mean, element to promote the podcast? What do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so I'm sure you see this too, where a lot of people will put out a podcast and they're like, where are the people? And I'll ask them like, well, where are you talking about it? Where are you posting about it? They're like, on Apple Podcast. I'm like, okay, well, this is number one. This is the issue. Like, Apple Podcasts and Spotify are not the most searchable platforms, right?
Okay.
Not many people are going to find your podcast just by the homepage of Apple Podcasts. I wish that was how it was, but that's not. So you have to have some element to be able to actually talk about the show away from the podcast. So, as I mentioned, like repurposing your reels, repurposing your content into blog posts. As I mentioned, I work with a lot of coaches. And so maybe even taking some of your episodes and putting it into a course that you've created, or you could put your About You episode on your About page on your website. There's places to repurpose your podcast. And I think that's really where the magic happens. That's really where you're able to build your audience and connect with them and get in front of them in more places.
Gotcha. Okay, so you talked about knowing your niche, building community, and then using those tools to create a place where your audience can connect with you the best ways that podcasters can connect with their audience. So that's really, really solid and good advice from that that you've given us. Now, what are some of the big problems that you see with podcasting today that you think it either something that is a big problem now or something that you might think it might be a bigger problem like later in the future?
Okay. I think that, as I talked about, not posting about it anywhere, not talking about it, I think not creating the right content during the right time. But I also think that the podcast industry is changing so fast. It's sometimes hard to stay on top of things. I mean, when I started, video podcasts were not a thing, like at all. And that wasn't that long ago, right?
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it was all audio.
Yeah. And, you have a great studio and that's amazing. A lot of people won't put in the time to create great studios. And it's now with things elevating so fast, like having a really good studio, having a video component, having all of these different things, it's easier now to stand out in the podcast space. But I think the problem, to your point or your question, is people not willing to adapt as quickly. There's still a lot of audio only podcasts, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you get so much more content when you do video. And then
that's true.
And does it work if you just do like a video in a dark room? No, probably not. You're going to have some like visual component, right? And so it's just always staying up to date. Podcasting is now like a whole production, which has never been before. I mean, we see Call Her Daddy, we see Girls Gotta Eat. Like, these are big sets. Even Joe Rogan is another big, they have big sets, and that didn't exist a couple of years ago. So I think the problem, problem in quotation marks, is things are changing. And as a smaller podcaster, are we going to be able to keep up with it? Do we want to keep up with it? I think it comes down to knowing your message and knowing what you want to achieve. If you want to be top 10, you're going to have to.
Yeah.
You want to be like ranking in the charts, you have to stay up to date with all these things. Now, if you just want a niche podcast with a little audience, right? Like, then you have more freedom to do what you want and like express yourself in your own way or do whatever makes the most sense to you. But yeah, I think the evolution is kind of like the craziest thing to me right now. What have you seen with your clients too?
Well, I'll share my example from my own podcast. So the Faith Fight podcast is the one that started it all for me. I had that one since 2018 or 2019, somewhere around there. It's been a long time. And for the most part, it's an audio only podcast. Even to this very day, it's an audio only podcast. But I realized last year that I needed to have some sort of element of video. To touch on one of the points that you mentioned earlier about repurposing content. I have the studio now, right? So it's easier for me, right? But I can record the audio only version of my podcast. But what I actually do is I flick on the camera and actually record the video of me recording the audio of my podcast. And I use that as short form content on social media so that I can, build that engagement with people out there and share my message and say, hey, if you want the full version of this episode, go listen to the audio version of the podcast. Now, oftentimes, so my other podcast, it's mainly a solo podcast, but oftentimes I do bring on guests and I do an interview-based podcast. When I do an interview podcast with someone else, I will put the whole video, I'll publish the whole video. But if it's just me, it's audio only, but I do still record the video because I use that as short form content. Because I find that short form content is one of the key pieces that you can use in order to get more engagement or get the word out there because it's so shareable. It's so easy for people to, get a sneak peek or a clip from your podcast and just share it to someone else. And then you could have someone else, a new listener to your podcast right there. So that's something that I do, or I saw it as a problem and I kind of addressed it that way, where I just turn on the camera. I still have my audio only podcast, but the camera's there recording. One of the other things that I see as a problem is people, like from my client's perspective, they are not wanting to spend the money to get quality microphones. And now I'm partly guilty of this as well, because I know that there are some tools out there that can enhance audio, clean it up. There's one that I use called Alphonic. And I have clients that kind of just record into the microphones of their laptop and they send me the audio and then I clean it up for them and it sounds crystal clear, perfect. But I see that a lot of people who, not my clients, but a lot of people out there who are just using like any type of microphone. And I don't know about you, like from an audio perspective. So before I was podcasting, I used to produce music. So I have a really, really good ears for when things sound good. But if I hear a podcast that does not sound good, like I cannot listen to it. And I have a videographer friend. He said to me, he does podcasts and he does interviews, corporate interviews for companies and stuff like that with his videography business. He said to me, Chris, the video could be perfect, but if the audio isn't right, no one's going to listen. No one's going to listen. So the audio has to be like spot on. So my advice to everyone, I know that there are tools out there that can help to enhance the audio, but it can only do so much without making you sound like a robot.
That's like a new trend now. Like I know when people turn on like the AI features in Descript, if you've ever used it.
Yeah, the studio sound,
Studio sound, it sounds like a robot. It's crazy.
You sound like a robot, right? So you can use those tools, but if if it's dialed up too much, it won't sound as natural. Versus if you just spend a little money, I know microphones, can get really expensive, like the Shure mics. I have a Rode Pod mic here, which is kind of middle of the road, no pun intended. But it can get expensive, but it does actually help because if you can't have a podcast that has good quality audio, no one's going to want to listen. Like literally, I can listen to a podcast and if it's not recorded properly, I'll feel like my ears are bleeding and I can't do it. I can't listen to it. So that's one of the things. That's one of the things that I see as a problem going forward. And everybody wants to start a podcast now, right? So everyone wants to start a podcast. Not everybody wants to put in the money to get quality, microphones. And they're wondering why people don't listen to their podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm right there with you. And another thing is, I think it really makes podcasters feel more professional when they have the setup too. I was working with a client who was recording in her car on her phone, and it actually sounded fine. It was like, because it was in such a quiet space. She was like, Hayleigh, I don't feel like a real podcaster. And I was like, well, what would make you feel like a real podcaster? And it was truly just having a microphone that made her feel like a real podcaster. So sometimes it is like a mindset thing, but I'm right there with you where we actually might be pickier than most because this is what we do for our
Exactly.
job.
Exactly. Yeah. Actually, you
I'm
know
like,
what? I don't want to paint the picture like you can't get a good quality sound in audio with your cell phone microphone, because I had someone that I interviewed last year. Her name was Dawn Wecker, and she has a podcast called Dawnversations. And
I love that.
her podcast is great. You should go listen to it. Everyone out there, go listen to it. Go listen to my conversation with her from last year. She recorded, I think the number was about 300 episodes from her cell phone. And it sounded good. It sounded great. She did it in her closet. Right? So she closed the closet door and she was in there with the clothes hanging up in the closet and everything. And it worked as like a sound buffer. So when I listened to her podcast before I interviewed her, I couldn't tell that she didn't use like a quality microphone. Wow. So if you are going to use your cell phone, you got to do a lot more work in your room to like treat it or go in a closet somewhere. Yeah. So that the acoustics that the microphone is picking up is just right. You don't want to have a podcast that doesn't sound, it doesn't sound good. Right. Let me just say that just to keep it simple.
No, I agree with you. And I think, when people ask me about like, how do I stand out with my podcast? It truly is just being better than these like tiny things, right? It's like maybe having a mic or at least really good audio quality. It's when you show up on social media, is it on brand? Do you have a brand for your podcast? When someone sees your content, do they know it's you? Is it having great interviews and great solo episodes and great topics? Like, to be a standout podcaster in this space, I think with so many podcasts that don't put effort into it, it's not hard to stand out, right? Like if you want to be better, then you just have to do better. That's just what it comes down to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if you just put a little bit more effort into it, turn on a camera, put up a ring light or something, just to or go in a place that is well lit, you can actually make that difference and actually get a little bit more people listening to your podcast, watching your reels, engaging with your content. Now, we're talking a little bit about tools and stuff like that to help get a better sounding podcast. But I want to ask this question. What are some of the intangible things that podcasters can do to become better?
I love that question. Okay, I think number one is going back to my point of listening to understand rather listening to respond. There's a lot that you could go into with that topic, because I think the skill of listening helps you in every aspect of life, especially podcasting, right? Yeah. So I think number one is focusing on that. I also think when it comes to how you present yourself through like your, voice, and even I say, or those are like my words. I'm working on it. I listen to myself talk all the time, and still somehow I have these vocal things.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of them, but it's something that once you're aware of, it's nice to work on. And so I think that's another thing that podcasters can work on, the way that they speak or how clearly they can get points across. I would say those are probably the main two. And I think those can take a long time to focus on. But if you can really get clear on those and enhance the way that you talk, I think that can really set you like way ahead.
Yeah, that's good. One of the things that, like, if I had to ask myself that question, one of the things that I would tell people is your energy levels. Because I've listened to podcasters, I've listened to episodes where the topic was something that I wanted to listen to, but the person speaking their energy levels were just so flat that I couldn't handle it no more. Like I couldn't listen no more. So, and
like that's a bad lecture, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that we can control. We can control our energy levels, right? And it's also, having good energy levels is actually something that is contagious, right? So even if you're interviewing someone who is like, maybe they're very monotone and kind of, for lack of a better word, boring, right? Your energy levels can actually pick them up, and people can feel like the energy when you're talking with someone. And that's one of the things that I tell all of my clients that I work with. When you get on your podcast, make sure your energy levels are not just 100%, but like 150%, because you got to be able to pick up the person who you're talking to or reach through, the speakers of the person listening to you to, connect with them. So make sure that your energy levels are, up there. That's one of the things one of the intangibles that I kind of encourage people with all the time, something that is absolutely within our own control. You know what I mean?
I love that. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that, some podcasts host pre-calls and then they can kind of get talk about it, maybe get the person more used to it. I personally don't do pre-calls, but I think that it would work for any new podcaster, any podcaster, honestly. But I think that's a point where you could be like, oh my gosh, this person has low energy or they're really nervous, and kind of gauge it that way too.
Yeah, perfect. Let's pivot back to talk a little bit more about your podcast. I want to ask you, is there, if for the people who are just hearing about you for the first time, in both of your podcasts, which episode should people go to first to get a good idea of who you are, what you talk about, or something that is the most beneficial for them? Which episodes should they go to first? If you can remember. Okay. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I think you might have one on the top of your head that you could probably share.
Okay. So for Podcast Cafe, there are, I think, 21 or 22 episodes up right now. So definitely go through, and I titled them really in a way that makes it clear and clickable. So one that I really would love everyone to listen to is with one of my clients, Lisa Cooper Ellison. She has the podcast called Writing Your Resilience. And so these are people who are writing a memoir or personal essays and about terrible things that have happened in their life. Her podcast has made me cry before, honestly. It's like one of those that is so touching, and she holds space for her guests so well. She lets them be emotional while she still is a strong host and doesn't let her emotions get in the way. And I interviewed her on my show about how to hold space for your guests, because sometimes people will come on the show and something will trigger them, or they'll go way too into a topic, or you see that they're getting emotional, and it's hard to hold space in that time. I once had someone come on my entrepreneurial podcast and tell me her entire birth story. I edited it out because I was horrified, but I was like, what do I do in this situation? And Lisa is a great example of how to handle those. So I think hers is a really good one to listen to.
Okay.
I also interviewed someone named Amelia Hruby. She has the podcast Off the Grid, and it's all about how to promote yourself without social media. So anyone who's a little burnt out from social media can go get some ideas from there. She has a great podcast. It's top perform. I've learned a lot from her. I personally will never leave social media, but I think it's interesting to see what other traditional marketing tool or tactics there are other than just social media. So those would be the two on Podcast Cafe that I would recommend. For Employee to Boss, honestly, one of my latest episodes, it's all about funding from venture capitalists and how only 2% of funding goes to women-owned businesses, and only 5% goes to Black-owned businesses. Literally, these venture capitalists are not funding the right businesses. It's very much like a white man world that's there. So I think that was a really, really interesting conversation, and I can't even explain it and do it justice. I think that you really just have to go listen to that episode. It's with Jessie Gabriel. Her business is called All Places because she says women belong in all places, and that's what it's all about. So I believe that was one of my latest episodes. But yeah, I think that that's a really important conversation because, I talk to people all day about their entrepreneurial journey, but that's really, really where I think hearing why people go into business and how they can be so mission driven, I think that's really inspirational. So you'll learn a lot, but you'll also hear her inspirational story on there too.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, that's good. So listen, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put links for all of both of your podcasts and your social medias and any other way that people can connect with you. everyone listening, go check the description. Everything is there, and you can go listen to those episodes. Because actually, so I listened to a few in the past of your podcast. I didn't listen to these ones, but I will go back and I will check them out, because some of the things that you mentioned, especially the person who is promoting her podcast without using social media, that I would love. Yeah, I love to learn stuff like that, because some people feel like the way that people talk about social media when it comes to their business, I know it's a great tool to have, but there has to be other ways, that you can promote your podcast or share something or whatever, right? And it's good to keep your mind open so that you can learn these different ways of marketing and different ways of getting your word out there to other people. Now, one of the things that this is just another question that actually just came to my head. So I'm going to ask you. You kind of mentioned it just a moment ago in your previous question. What are your top 3 people online that you like to learn from when it comes to podcasting?
Okay, I love that. So I think number 1 is Alex Hormozi. I am a huge fan of him and Hayleigh Hayhurst. That's
his wife, right?
Yeah, I went to their event in Las Vegas and I did a podcast episode about what I learned. It was like crazy 2 days, but I really do enjoy his podcast, The Game. The style he does it in is more relaxed, but I think that a lot of people can learn from that podcast. Other people I like to learn from podcasting, I really love the podcast Financial Feminist. She hosts really strong interviews as well. She's also in Seattle, which is just random, but I love that. Nice. So her name is Tori Dunlap. And then third, oh my gosh, who else do I listen to? I do love Monica Yates. Hers is more of like a business femininity podcast. So those would probably be the 3 people that I listen to. But honestly, I do listen to a lot of podcasts, but since I listen to so many for my clients in my own time, I don't listen to a ton. But those are 3 great podcasts, because they all run ads too in certain ways. So, I mean, we didn't really talk about ads in this conversation, but a lot of people will just speed past the ads. But as a podcaster, I think you should listen and see who's running ads and how they're doing it. So that's also another place where you can listen to.
Yeah. So let's talk about ads for a moment.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So do you think a podcaster should put money into, to promoting their ad? Or promoting their podcast, I should say, like sponsored posts to get the word out about their podcast. And then also on the flip side of that as well, like monetization, running ads in their podcast. What are your views on it? Because I know like new podcasters, they don't have the clout, to get sponsors in on their podcast, and they're not really making any money to kind of put ads out there about their podcast.
Yeah.
But what should be the approach that we should take as podcasters to get the word out there? Like, should we go down that route to maybe sacrifice a few dollars every month to get sponsored posts about our own podcast, hoping that, we might get more listeners and then eventually be able to get sponsors for our podcast? Right. What are your thoughts about it?
Right. I think if the goal is to have like an influencer level podcast and have a ton of listeners, then if you want to boost a few posts here and there, I don't focus on running advertisements. I've never done it for my business. I've boosted a few posts on Instagram. That's about like the extent that I've gone to. There's a lot of, there's Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but there's also smaller players that you can advertise on, like, what is it, Player FM? I'm blanking on the names of them, but there's other podcast streaming platforms that you can advertise on that I know a lot of people find success in. But I think you can grow an organic podcast. And I think that's where the focus should be, at least until you get your footing. When it comes to the boosted posts, make sure that if these are like clips, they're actually good clips that tell you what the podcast is about. I know it seems obvious, but I always, since I'm in the podcast space, I always get other people's sponsored posts about their podcast. And if it starts with like the clip, if it starts with a pause or just laughing or an or whatever, like you have to get to the point. You have to make these clips like...
You got to get to the hook right away.
Exactly. And so if you do decide to put money behind your podcast to promote it, make sure that what you're putting out there is like your best foot forward. Now, where it comes to the having sponsors on your show or running ads on your show, this is where I help a lot of my clients with, because since I work with businesses, I want them to run their own ads in their podcast. We're so quick to having other brands promote in our show, but honestly, podcast ads don't pay a ton. And I think that's like a big misconception. I saw someone post, it was like, is a podcast a viable side hustle? And I was like, it can be if you put a lot of time and effort into it. But podcast sponsors don't pay a ton, right? Mm-hmm. It's like $50 per 1,000 listens. And sometimes the podcasts I work with are not getting 1,000 listens a month, right? Like they might, like they're reaching the right people, but it doesn't have like the big numbers behind it. So what I always recommend is run your own ads in your own podcast because, you know, me, you, any business owner probably has offers that are higher than $50. So like,
absolutely.
if you're going to put your focus anywhere, focus on building your own brand and your own business rather than trying to go out there and find the next sponsor. If you don't have anything to sell, that's a whole nother strategy where, you know, sponsors would make more sense. You could start with affiliate codes. You could start with like newsletter swap. Like there's a lot of different places that you can, but yeah, I think for business owners, before you even think, who's going to sponsor my podcast? Sponsor your own podcast.
Sponsor
I beg
yourself.
you.
Absolutely. And if you don't have anything, one of the things that I'm doing with my other podcast is I'm using a lot of the episodes that I have done in the past, and I'm kind of cherry picking the best ones. And I'm actually turning that into, I'm getting it transcribed and turning it into a book. And that's something that I'm going to sell through my podcast, right? So for everyone out there, if you have a podcast, you have some episodes, maybe you can write a book. And there you go. You can sell your book through your podcast, right? You can be your first client or your first sponsorship on your podcast, right? So that's just, again, another tip or something that we can do. And I feel like the numbers game when it comes to especially like social media and listens. Now, I didn't do the math for myself, but I know that there's like a, what do you call it? How valuable your followers are, how valuable one follower is worth to you.
Yeah.
And if you do the math and look at how many followers you have versus how much money your social media or your podcast is actually making, you can actually figure out if you're actually doing well or if you're not doing well. Here's an example. So if you have 10,000 followers or 10,000, subscribers on your podcast, but you're not even bringing in $100 a month, all of those followers are worth next to nothing, right? Versus if you only have maybe about 50 followers or subscribers to your podcast, but you're bringing in $500 a month, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You do the math, it makes a bit more sense. So we need to, as podcasters, we need to just kind of shift our mindset a little bit and stop looking for the vanity numbers of followers and stuff like that just to make ourselves feel better. But are you actually serving those followers well enough so that they become clients, right? That's something that we need to think about as podcasters. All right, Hayleigh, I am about to wrap up now. I don't want to stop talking to you because this has been such a great conversation, but we got to get back to our days. Listen, this is my final question. I usually end every single episode like this. I'm going to ask you, is there anything that I may have forgotten to ask you that you want to share? And if you can give one takeaway for all of the podcasters out there, what would it be?
Yeah, well, I've had so much fun on this chat with you, Chris. So thanks so much for having me. I feel like we talked about everything that, if any of the listeners have any questions, you and I can be great resources for them being in the podcast world all day. So I think we pretty much covered everything when it comes to podcasting. My advice for podcasters is to just show up consistently, whatever consistently means to you. I think these days it's very much like we see people putting out 2, 3, 4 episodes a week. I interviewed someone that does 5 episodes a week, right? And then we get really bogged down with, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough? And figure out what consistency means to you and stick with it. That could mean an episode a week, 2 episodes a month, 1 episode a month. I interviewed someone on my show that has had a podcast for the last 16 years, doing 1 episode a month consistently. Figure out, that's way better than burning yourself out and 6 months, right? Like figure out what consistency means and stick with that. That's my biggest piece of advice for any podcaster.
And I echo those sentiments because consistency will actually get you further than just, giving everything you got for, a month and then burning out.
Yes.
But remain consistent, space out your time, take your rest when you need to, and, just keep going. Wow. One podcast every single month for 16 years. That's amazing. But Hayleigh, thank you so much. Like I said, I can be here and talk to you for the rest of the day because this has been such a great conversation. So again, your podcasts are called the Espresso Podcast Cafe.
Yeah, Podcast Cafe. Yes.
Yeah, right. And from employee to boss, right?
Yes.
Now, I put links for all of that, everybody, in the description. So connect with Hayleigh on her socials and listen to her podcast. And, you will get a lot of tips and tricks and you will learn a little bit more about podcasting. And, we'll all get better through, learning from each other and listening to the experience that we have to share. So go and check out Hayleigh and the things that she's doing. So thank you very much, Hayleigh. This has been a blast. I kind of want to set up a part 2 of this conversation already because it's been so fun. But I know we got to get back to our days. But thank you so much for being on I Made a Podcast today. This has been wonderful.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.